and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, station manager for Manatee Educational Television. And today we have with us a return guest. For those who watched Up Close recently, you'll see that we were visited by Elizabeth Huntoon Coursen, who talked about the upcoming documentary Rosenwall. Well, Liz was such a fascinating guest that we've invited her back to talk a little bit about her expertise and her wide expanse of knowledge in writing several different types of books. So Liz, thank you very much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to have you and to talk with you. And we found you fascinating when you were talking about Rosenwall. And today we want to talk a little bit about you and your careers. And as you can see, we only have a few of your books here. You're actually the author of 9 books.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, I am.
All since 2009.
Yes, that's correct.
And that's fascinating. And what was the first book that you came out with?
Well, my first book was Brunswick and Bowdoin College, which is a postcard history of my hometown, Brunswick, Maine, and the college in it, Bowdoin College. And I use my 30-year collection of vintage postcards to illustrate the book.
Well, what a fascinating thing. So you have this vintage postcard collection?
Yes, I do.
And tell us a little bit about that. When did that start?
Well, it started after college when I was interested in becoming married. And I wanted to decorate my home in a welcoming fashion for this as yet unmet future husband. And so I began to collect antiques. And one of the antique shows that I went to, there was a little box of vintage postcards. And I saw my hometown in 1906 with the streets unpaved and horse-drawn carriages on the streets. And I was immediately fascinated and drawn in. And that began what would become a 30-year collecting hobby. What
a fascinating hobby to have. And these are postcards from all over the world in the United States?
Well, I started the way most people do, which is with my hometown. And gradually I began to be aware of the other postcards that were available and began to collect other categories, including Florida.
See, that sounds like an idea for another show to feature that down the road, Liz. I'd love to do that. I mean, it's a fascinating way to see the history of something through vintage postcards.
Absolutely. And there's no state that was more affected by postcards than Florida, because Florida's postcards went out, especially in February and March, to people up north, and everyone said, having fun, wish you were here. And they looked around them and saw the snow and saw these beaches in Florida and said, oh, I need to go to Florida.
That's exactly right. And you know, they had the rotogravure type of gradation of color. It was very beautiful, and there's wonderful collections that are throughout here in Manatee County. But as an author, as that first-time author writing about your hometown and Bowdoin College, was that kind of an overwhelming undertaking, you know, for your first book?
Well, people say that you should start and write about what you know. And going back in time, researching my hometown's history, the research about Bowdoin College, imagining people back then, and then bringing myself up to my own early years in Brunswick, it was really very emotional and engaging.
And you know, and this is, you know, as a young woman, you know, undertaking for your first book, did it seem overwhelming at the time to try to do that? No,
it was something I hadn't really thought about before, and so I just organized the postcards in a way that I felt that they told a story in a logical way. So I have them divided in town and gown and then outlying areas.
What a great way to do that. So that initial book, Brunswick and Bowdoin College, you know, that gave you the impetus, you know, to go on to your future successes for additional books. Is that correct?
It did. It gave me the inspiration and the confidence, because once I had that first book under my belt, and I was working with the publisher, and the publisher, for whatever reason, I felt that, gee, I could probably do this a little bit better. And so I had this confidence that I could go on and do another book. And this particular book gave me the inspiration because there's one particular postcard that was very motivational. And so I took that and ran with it.
Well, tell us about that. What was that one postcard?
Well, it's a real photo postcard of a handsome young man, completely anonymous, sitting in a room with a big Bowdoin banner behind him on the wall. And the photographer was also anonymous, no handwriting on the card. And I thought, who is this? because I had to feel it was a Bowdoin student, because no young man worth his salt would sit calmly in front of a college banner unless he was a student. And I began to research the young man. It turned out he was a man named Leon Dearborn Mincher, who had died at 99 as Bowdoin's oldest living alumnus. I contacted his family, and his family had amazing stories to tell about his wonderful, inspirational, and motivational life. And yet no one had written the stories down. And it was such a shame. And then I realized that I hadn't written my grandmother's stories down. And that led me to my second book, which is called The Complete Biography Workbook.
Excellent, and we want to hear about that. But I find that story so unique, and you know that became like the catalyst for you to develop, you know, this great talent of yours to, you know, to bring these not only these stories but this information together. Because being an author requires a great deal of research as well, and you know, and all of your books have that kind of depth of research in them.
They're kind of scholarly, I like to think.
Yeah, very much so.
I like to think.
Very much so. It requires a great deal of research and detail, attention to detail, you know, to make sure that not only are you telling the story, but you're telling it in an accurate fashion as well. So what came next? After Brunswick and Bowdoin College, your next book was? The
Complete Biography Workbook. And when I'd go around the state to talk about the importance of writing your stories down, otherwise they'll be lost. People began to send me manuscripts to be edited prior to publication. And I realized that if I was going to be an editor, I had to command authority about American punctuation and grammar. So I embarked on my third book, which is about American punctuation and grammar, self-editing for the self-published author.
And it's very critical too, because you know everyone feels that they have a book or a story, and some people are very good writers, but they don't know how to tell it in such a grammatically correct fashion. Is that correct?
That's true. And one thing I learned from my first book, it's really up to the individual author to present a manuscript that is as nearly flawless as possible to his or her editor prior to publication. And if you're going to present yourself as an author, I feel like you need to have a firm foundation, at least on the basics of American English.
Now, editors will correct anyway, and they'll go through it in detail. But you know, you have to put that forth, that initial effort.
I agree, and there's so much you can do yourself, which is the purpose of my what are called style guides.
And that's the terminology that I was going to use. The editing for the successful student, the book tourist, before you even open your mouth. These are like, you know, in-depth, thoroughly researched style guides for people that can take that information and develop their own techniques. Is that correct?
Absolutely, because there's nothing that I've done that someone else can't do as well. And there's also no reason to reinvent my mistakes. So when I got along to the book tourist, which is 7 steps to a wildly successful book tour, I had been out and about for several years, and I had made so many mistakes that I felt like I could share these 7 steps that I'd condensed.
So no one else has to repeat those same mistakes.
Exactly. So there's just no reason to have to make the mistakes and reinvent the wheel.
See, and I would think, you know, being out there, 9 books out there, you've been on many book tours and see that, oh, shoulda, coulda, woulda, done that. I don't want to do this. I do want to do that. But for a lot of authors, first-time authors particularly, they don't know that.
They don't. And it's nice to be able to share what I've learned. And to me, a book tour, people have gotten away from kind of boots on the ground, eyeball to eyeball interaction with your audience and your potential readers. But I think that's a really crucial part of it, because I've actually learned so much from my audiences speaking to them, all my potential readers in one place, and then they ask me questions. It goes back and forth and opens up new avenues for exploration and interest.
Well, and I think that's really good for a first-time author to have that, because they want their book to be successful. They want to reach out to audiences, and they don't want to like have to, you know, learn the hard way, so to speak.
Exactly.
Give us 1 or 2 of the steps for a wildly successful book tour.
Well, the first step, hands down with a bullet. If I tell my audiences for this particular program, if you learn nothing else from me, please learn this. You've got to be able to communicate. You've got to be able to convey your book's message in succinct sound bites. The best way to do that is to join Toastmasters International.
And learn how to be a successful speaker.
Yes, exactly. It is just life-changing. And I would not be able to do what I do with my book tour events without this experience I have from Toastmasters.
And I would think, too, in this age of sound bites and quick things, you want to be able to convey your thought and your, and the meaning of your book and the significance of your book very succinctly, but at the same time articulate it in such a manner that people are intrigued.
Absolutely.
And interested.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, and we want to talk a little bit more about some of your other books, but one book particular that I want to spend some time on is this one here. It's Shade in the Sunshine State, Reflections on Segregation in Florida. I'm going to hold that up for people to see here so everybody gets it. This is a very unique book, and I think it's a subject matter that's really not identified that much, because when people think of segregation, they think of the terrible civil rights struggle, they don't necessarily think about Florida. But Florida had very significant segregation issues through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and through the 70s. Is that correct?
Actually, even earlier, Florida was as segregated by law and by custom as any typically southern state that you care to name. And no one, as you mentioned, no one really thinks about Florida. They think Florida was just a manifestation of Walt Disney's imagination. And yet Florida, along with Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, Tennessee, all those states, those are states that you'd think of as Southern before you think of Florida.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a very unique look at it, because Florida had the Jim Crow laws. They had deep segregation in schools, in buildings, and opportunities. And I think, this is a very important book because it does show this history that, Florida had at the period of time. First of all, what intrigued you to kind of capture this subject?
Well, I was getting these manuscripts from people who were writing their memoirs and autobiographies, and I realized I'd missed World War II. I was so sorry to recognize that the World War II veterans had largely passed away. And yet I felt I understood World War II to a certain extent, but the stories I was getting from people of my mother's age had to do with segregation, and I knew nothing. And I couldn't even get my head around what it must have been like to live in Manatee County, Sarasota County in the 1950s when the schools were segregated. And I realized that there was no one source book that I could go to read about Florida's specific and unique history. And I began to have notes, and then I thought, I'll just compile all these notes into a book.
And the stories were pretty rampant about segregation in Florida. I mean, and in this area alone, Sarasota beaches were segregated, then schools were segregated. You probably had a wealth of material to kind of cull through.
I did, and I think that people are ready to share some of their thoughts and experiences which they maybe haven't been ready to in the last decade or two. And so when I've gone around to the state presenting this program, I've had people get up and apologize. I've had people get up and cry. I've had people get up and shake hands. So people are ready to come to grips with what they lived through. And it's time to talk about this.
As you're doing this, and this is very, a wonderful book, I think, for educators, for students, for the community at large to understand that, even though Florida's a wonderful place to live and to do businesses, you've got to really examine the past and the history to see if you want to move, when you can move forward, and this is significant. Was there someone or some individual during your research that you came upon and said, this person really made a difference?
Well, everyone did, and that was the thing that was so surprising to me. There's a marriage of scholarly research in the book, very good timeline, excellent bibliography, but there's also this weaving of individual stories, personal accounts of what people witnessed and thought about what they witnessed. But I think the most significant part of this book is the oral history of the young man who desegregated Gainesville High. And it turned out that the white students didn't want him, and when he went back to the black high school, the black students felt he was a traitor. And he writes in his oral history, or he says in his oral history, which has been transcribed, that he felt his life was cursed. And it was so difficult to read because this person was only about 10 years older than I was. And I was just heartbroken to read his account of his high school years because he was neither fish nor fowl.
Yeah, and it was a tough time during that segregation, and some people are surprised that segregation in Florida, I mean, was up into the late 60s, early 70s.
Early 70s.
When the final integration was implemented. And for us, for me, that seems like quite late, but really that's the timetable that it took.
Well, Pinellas County fought until 1971. So really, this is fairly contemporary history that we're talking about. And it's startling to talk about Florida in this context.
And I think it's very important I mean, this obviously is a labor of love and your thing, you know, to look at this and to do the deep and scholarly research that you did, but also, you know, to have this information surface at a time when, you know, racial strife and, you know, miscommunication is becoming more and more apparent throughout the state. Well,
I've got to tell you, though, that you read this book and you realize that no matter what the current situation is right now, we have come a long way in historical context, very short amount of time. So those of us who are impatient, those of us who want more change more quickly, you have to look at the context and see where we were within our lifetimes. And because the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, the pivotal Supreme Court decision, was handed down in 1954. That's right. Which is fairly contemporary.
And, it was like, and wasn't the key sentence there was with all deliberate speed?
Yes, it was.
But obviously that meant a lot of different things to different people.
Exactly.
You know, I mean, if the court handed down the decision in 54, and you said Pinellas integrated in 71?
They fought and through 71.
And I think here in Manatee County, it was 69, I believe it was. So. But one of the things that I think is critical is that this is wonderful for students, you know, both at high school or college level, to understand that this is a history of how this state developed, and I would heartily recommend it, for those people who have an interest not only in the history of the state, but also in how race relations has changed.
Thank you. I am so proud of it. It's just a great book and very insightful essays in it, and I'm thrilled. I really am.
But this is only part of your body of work. As I mentioned at the very beginning, you're the author of 9 books, and you have, I'm sure, many others in the works, and we'll talk about that briefly. But the overall thing is, aside from your style guides and your historical research, what are those things that kind of draw you, to writing a book? What are those things that make a difference to you that you say, I need to write something about this?
Well, one thing I've started to do as I go out and about with my programs, I watch my audience and I watch them lean in. I'm always looking for these lean-in moments where my audience is so engaged with what I'm saying, so interested, so vitally concerned that they don't want to miss a syllable and they're leaning in. And one example with the Shade and the Sunshine State program that I've been giving for 2 years across the state is when I start talking about the Rosenwald schools. And people always are leaning in. But I leaned in the first time I read a reference to a Rosenwald school. So I saw my audience, and that gave me the idea to say, not only is there an opportunity for another book, but there's an opportunity for a program specifically targeted to this one topic.
And I think that's the thing. There's something that you sense from the audiences around you, but also for a need to kind of further explain and use your talent and your insight into providing additional information. All of your books, all 9, I would think, are available through your website, and we want to put that website up for people to see. And people can order these or send you a question or two, I suppose. But they're all available, is that correct?
Yes, all available through Amazon.com, actually.
Oh.
If you go to my website, there are links directly to Amazon.com.
Right, and it's lizcoursen.com, or another one is editnation.com as well, that your books are available to be from. Now, Liz, we're kind of winding down a little bit, and I want to spend a few minutes, if I may, on what's next for you. You know, this is a prolific body of work. You know, since 2009 to have 9 books, I mean, that's tremendous. But I'm sure that there's other things that are of interest to you or brought to your attention that you would like to, you know, to work on. What are some of those things that are in the works for you? Well,
the next big book, the scholarly book, is going to be the Rosenwald Schools of Florida.
Ah, wonderful, wonderful idea.
I'm looking forward to that. I'm going up to Fisk University the first week of December to do research, because the Rosenwald Fund papers are held at Fisk. And I have the RosenwaldSchoolsOfFlorida.com, which is up and asks for information. I'm also doing an anthology, First Breath, Last Breath, which is going to be a compilation of stories by daughters who were there when their mothers died. And this happened to me recently. It was a very profound and incredible experience. And I've talked to other daughters who were there at their mother's deaths, and they also have amazing stories to share.
And I think that could be, you know, certainly inspirational, you know, for people to share that. You know, what a great opportunity, you know, for you to take those emotional stories and kind of channel that into for your readers. Yeah,
there's something powerful that happens when you're an author, and I'd like to be able to share that experience with other people. I mean, they might have the chops yet to write a full book, but they might be able to write an engaging essay.
Well, I can't thank you, Liz, enough for, you know, taking the time to do this and for sharing some of your books. We have 5 of the 9 up here, but you know, what a great body of work, and you know, what a charming and articulate and engaging author that you are. Excuse me. What do you want people to know about your books and the importance of them? Well,
I guess I would tell people that being a published author is one of the best experiences in the world, and what I have done, you can do too.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us. This is a wonderful book here, Shade in the Sunshine, Reflections on Segregation in Florida, and I would encourage everyone to pick this up, as also take a look at some of the other books that are available.
Thank you.
Liz, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to bringing you back, maybe in the future, to talk about some of the Rosenwald stories that you're working on.
Thank you, Charles.
Liz, thank you again for joining us. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Up Close on METV. For additional information on Liz's work, go to her website and find out what books are available. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on Up Close on METV.